When the infant was born, the millionaire, who had paid a homeless lady to bear a child, was astounded by what he saw before we start the narrative, by leaving a comment below with the city you're viewing from. Have fun. Henry Lewis was a 42-year-old guy with all the money, power, and position. But that evening, he came to the realization that, in spite of everything he had in his life, his money had not purchased, and Henry didn't want a family in the conventional sense, but he needed a child. He had made 2 unsuccessful attempts at marriage, both of which ended in disappointment. Believed that love was a myth that would just cause issues. But having a child was an investment, continuity of what he had created, and he was now resolved not to look for a relationship because he required a clear. He knew that using his resources, he could locate a contract without any emotional entanglements. An individual who is prepared to carry the pregnancy without any concerns or emotional attachments for this deal, like all of his others, would have given Henry a total control now. All he had to do was locate a buyer. The following morning, Henry Lewis drove his finding someone who would accept the contract was his main concern, though, as he drove a sports vehicle across the city. And while he was paused at a signal close to downtown, he noticed something on the sidewalk corner. A young woman with disheveled brown hair cascading over her face, and her blue eyes sat on the ground and drew on a piece of filthy paper. Even though she was exhausted, her eyes shone, giving the impression that she was invisible. Others, but Henry tried to ignore her when the light turned green, but something about her drew his attention. Again, irritated with himself, he drove off thinking, who draws on the sidewalk as if nothing else exists? Leaving her behind, he halted a few blocks away because something disturbed him. He sat in the parking lot, gazing at the steering wheel, when he had a thought. He thought, this is absurd. But his instincts forced him to back off. Reluctantly, he turned the car around and returned to the spot where he had first spotted her. And she was still leaning the paper against the wall. He drew up to the curb, rolled down the window, and said, "Hey, you come here," in a stern and icy tone. The young woman's brows furrowed as she scrutinized the well-dressed man in the sports automobile. She hesitated, saying, "Come on, I don't have all day." He insisted that she not. When she eventually stood up, he slowly and grudgingly changed his tone and came closer. Despite the fact that her thinness and appearance were even more noticeable next to the car, there was something with her stance and the way she gazed at him. She said, "What do you want?" Henry observed her for a time before answering. "Get in, in a firm but low voice. He scowled. "Take me somewhere we can talk." She laughed uncontrollably. "I'm not one of those." "I'm obviously annoyed by the assumption, so don't be ridiculous. I just want to talk, so get in the... There was still some uncertainty, but there was something about his forceful tone that said, "Car?" or you can keep living on that sidewalk. Gave her no space to argue. So at last, she opened the door and entered the... They drove to a peaceful cafe outside of the city. And although there was a lot of stillness between them, Henry didn't seem to mind. As they sat at a table in the corner, he inquired, "What's your name, Leah Parker? So why is it important?" With a dubious expression, she shot out, "I need to know who I'm dealing with. Tell me, Ilila, why do you sit on the..." She shrugged and avoided his stare as she drew on the sidewalk, as if nothing else mattered. "What else is there to do? I have nowhere." He leaned closer and said, "I lost everything, but that's none of your business." With his elbows resting on the table, "I'll get right to the point." Her eyes sharpened as she made you an offer that may transform your life. Layla squinted as though she hadn't heard you right. "But you're kidding." "What would that be?" "I want you to have a child for me." "Yes, this is a genuine offer. I will pay for all of your costs and provide you with complete assistance. You will receive a sum at the end of the pregnancy that will guarantee you never have to worry about money." She crossed her arms and laughed nervously once more. "This is a joke, right? What type of man, who knows what he wants and doesn't waste time, would make such an offer to a stranger?" "Lila, I don't want a relationship. I just want a child, nothing more. I want you to have my child as much as possible," Leah said, staring at Henry as though he had gone insane. Even though she wanted to write off his suggestion as ridiculous, she could tell by the look in Henry's eyes that he was serious about his cold. "This is insane, Lila." Old logic struck her hard, leaving her divided between her dignity and the terrible realities of her situation. Henry didn't turn away when he eventually broke the stillness. No rational lady would consent to something like this. He continued to adopt the composed stance that was so natural to him, saying, "No woman in your position would refuse. To put it plainly, I'm offering you a new life, comfort, and security in return for what you already have." Layla crossed her arms in an attempt to keep up a front of defiance. But she was really, even though she knew he was correct and that she was in a circumstance where she had to fight for her life every day, the thought of giving up was still present. Her stomach turned over something so intimate for financial gain, and then what she asked Henry eased forward in his chair a little, as if he was skeptical of what would happen when the kid was born. Had expected the inquiry, "You'll receive a substantial sum to start your life over after the baby is born. There are no restrictions, so you can do everything you want." She released a... He looked closely at her and said, "Humorous laugh. And how do I know you won't change your mind and drag me into court later? I am a businessman, so before responding to Layla, I don't sign contracts without ensuring that everyone wins and that there is a legally enforceable agreement between us. We'll be able to modify the words later. So let's play around with those for a little. Only those who have gotten this far will comprehend if you type milkshake in the comments." Returning to the narrative, Layla became silent as she took in his words. The promise of security, even if it was only temporary, was alluring. She didn't even have a place to sleep that night. But she was aware that she was about to make a life-changing choice. And what if I decline? She questioned, bending forward a little. Henry smiled dimly. Then you return to the streets and continue to struggle in the face of hunger and the cold. The decision is yours, he said. Fell like a blow, and although she wanted to hate him for being so direct, she detested the truth he had about them much more. She was aware that he had backed her into a corner, but she still needed to ask. Why are you doing this? Demanded a man like you. So why not find or adopt a child with all your money? Henry took a long breath before responding to his tone further. He is one of those rich mothers who enjoy flaunting their ideal children. More serious than previously, as I desire something that is a blood heir, and because adopting or obtaining, I don't want to deal with the complexities that come with being associated with someone in my social circle. I want control. Layla looked away from him because of the coldness of his words. Nothing more, nothing less. She felt uneasy because she knew he was being truthful, which just increased her vulnerability. In an attempt to reclaim some control over the situation, she finally stated, I need time to think. Ki? Henry nodded as if he had anticipated this response. Don't bother getting in touch with me for 24 hours after that. He got up and moved in the direction of the door without saying another word. Lila felt as if she were being drawn into a tornado as she watched him vanish. Leah's mind raised Henry's as they walked through the streets, fearing they would never escape. She heard the words, comfort, stability, a new life, that she was familiar with. However, the bitter cold of the night stung her flesh, reminding her that tomorrow would bring the same hardships, the struggle for sustenance, the ongoing anxiety, and the humiliation of sitting on a park bench and gazing up at the cloudy sky. She was invisible to the outside world. Opportunities only come around once, and it's up to you to decide whether to take advantage of them. According to her mother, them or let them go, but she questioned the price of having a kid. Even as making a contract was a historic choice. But what if it was her only way out of the never-ending cycle of suffering? While all was going on, Henry was sitting in his living room going over a contract that his attorneys had painstakingly crafted. He detested waiting, but he was aware that Layla had few choices, and he had already estimated the dangers if she refused. The sound of the intercom broke his train of thinking, so he grabbed it up and moved on to someone else. Minutes later, he responded in a neutral tone after hearing his receptionist tell him that Lila had come and to send her up. When the door opened and Lila entered, her eyes were weary but resolute, so I accepted. Before Henry could respond, she remarked simply, and he got up to watch her intently. She didn't hesitate. Phrase, just a firm decision, great. Let's make this official. He waved. Lila carefully examined the provisions of the contract as he picked it up from the table, and she sat down. The terms were explicit that she would be cared for during her pregnancy, with all of her costs covered, and in exchange for giving up any claims to the money, she would receive a sizable sum to start over. Child, she whispered as she read. This seems final. That's exactly what Henry answered. I hope it's what you want too. Layla inhaled deeply, then after a brief moment of uncertainty, she picked up the pen and quickly scribbled her name, completing the deal that would alter their lives forever. The contract signing signaled the start of a new chapter in Lila's life, not merely a transaction. Parker's life that day, Stephanie Henry's assistant, led her to a black automobile that was parked at the building's entry. As she peered out the car window at the once overwhelming city that now appeared to give Layla didn't say much on the way to Henry's estate. But Stephanie talked of something new and an opportunity to start anew. Try to break the serenity. You'll enjoy the peaceful setting. The welcoming tone contrasted with the chilly surroundings of the roomy and, most importantly, pleasant Leah simply nodded, still taking in everything that had transpired over the last few hours when she signed the contract. Her eyes widened when the car finally pulled up to the mansion, and the enormous iron gate opened to expose a property. The mansion was situated in the middle of immaculately kept gardens. Stephanie took her into a massive marble and glass building that appeared to be as ruthless and cunning as the man who controlled it. Layla hardly had time to appreciate the opulent features inside the crystal. Wide marble stairs, chandeliers, and furnishings that appeared to have been created for a design magazine. Although it wasn't her world, this would be her new normal for the time being. Stephanie grinned and added, I'll show you to your room. It's one of the best suites in the house. Layla silently followed and was met by a massive bed as soon as she entered the room. With windows spanning the entire floor, linen sheets, and a bathroom bigger than any flat she had ever occupied. Stephanie previously added, if you need anything, just call me. We're here to take care of you. Leah sat on the edge of the bed and ran her hands over the silky surface, leaving her alone. The sheet's fabric was peculiar because, up until yesterday, she had been sleeping on chilly sidewalks. But now she was, even though it was luxurious and comfy, there was still something thick in the air. She was aware that she was a participant in a business transaction rather than a guest. In the days that followed, Layla made an effort to get used to the new routine. Meals were delivered on time, and a group of medical professionals was employed to administer preliminary tests. And as anticipated, Henry maintained he rarely left the house except to verify the reports Stephanie G. him on because he was concentrating on his work. Lila's development, on one of the infrequent occasions they met in the corridor as Leah was leaving a medical appointment, she noticed Henry approaching her with his customary straight posture and solemn expression. Are you all right? Leah hesitated before asking his tone. more out of duty than worry. Answering everything as expected, I suppose he nodded without delving deeper before turning to leave. He gave her a final glance and said, "I want you to be well, Stephanie." She wasn't sure what to think. Was the remark made out of real goodwill, or was it merely a means of making sure the brief encounter went well? Despite being pampered like a queen, Layla couldn't ignore the problems that started to emerge inside her on a quiet night. She strolled to her room's balcony and gazed at the expansive garden. Everything was so serene in the moonlight, so different from the reality hugging herself against the chilly wind. She wondered if she was doing the right thing. It seemed more complicated to carry a child and then give it away, even though the contract stated she didn't know how she would respond to the fact that she would obviously have no rights to the child. Henry, who knew Lila, observed everything emotionally in the meantime, was strong, but he also understood that, in spite of his aloof manner, she carried a lot of emotional weight. A slight curiosity about who she was, why she had accepted such a strange proposal, and why he couldn't totally dispel the suspicion that she might have been more than a pawn in a scheme. Lila wasn't a fan of classic literature, but one evening, she was in the living room looking through a book on the shelf. Henry surprised her by entering the house, yet there was something reassuring about the silence and the smell of ancient books. He appeared preoccupied while holding a folder of documents that I hadn't anticipated seeing. He stopped in the middle of the room and said, "I found you here. I didn't expect you to talk to me." She responded with a he scowled and smiled sarcastically. But instead of answering immediately, he put the folder on the table and took a seat in an armchair close by. "Are you becoming comfortable?" inquired, I believe, with his arms crossed, and she gave a hesitating response. "But it still feels." Henry leaned forward a little, saying, "Strange. It doesn't feel genuine. This is a deal, Layla, an agreement. I guarantee that everything will go according to plan." With a tinge of defiance, she added, "What you do, isn't it? Plan everything." He examined her intently, as though calculating everything would exclude any possibility of error. "I've constructed what I have planned by determining whether the discussion was worthwhile." When he eventually responded, "Failure," Layla chuckled briefly and occasionally shook her head. "Failure is unavoidable. You can prepare everything, but you have no control over how you feel." Henry was struck hard by her comments. He reclined in the chair without responding. Lila saw his reaction, but she didn't press the issue. Instead, she just picked up the book from the shelf and went to her room, leaving Henry by himself. And as the days passed, Leah Parker started to get used to living in Henry Lewis's. Despite the mansion's opulent and cozy surroundings, she was unable to get rid of the feeling that she didn't belong. Even though every piece of furniture and ornamental item seemed to shout that this wasn't her place. She continued with the routine. Meals made by chefs for regular medical consultations, notwithstanding the comfort, and at night, when she was by herself in her room, emotional emptiness persisted as she considered what she had left behind. Not that it was much. However, it was all she had ever known. And now everything seemed out of control. What would it be like to become pregnant, then give it to them? She attempted to ignore those ideas, but they persisted, particularly in the darkness. Henry observed Lila from a distance while she struggled with her inner demons, maintaining a detached manner. But he was intrigued and frequently found himself thinking about her even as he was attending meetings and obligations. It wasn't romantic or sentimental, at least not yet. But one afternoon, he returned with an inexplicable interest. After a long day of meetings, Henry came home to find Lila seated on a bench in the garden, with her face turned to the sky. The vista stood in stark contrast to his rough perception of her. Hesitantly went up to her, but finally approached her to enjoy the garden. Lila was a little taken aback when he inquired in his direct and hard manner, but she immediately. He sat next to her and replied, "It's nice, definitely better than the streets." There was something disarming about Lila's candor, so I kept my distance. He inquired, "Are you settling in?" Lila shrugged, gazing at the flowers before her. "It still seems weird, Henry said, it's all part of the agreement." After a moment of silence about living someone else's life. "To ensure that everything goes according to plan, I want you to have everything you need." Henry glanced at her and asked, "Do you always live like this, planning every second of your life?" With a note of cynicism. He was taken aback by the inquiry because he was accustomed to individuals who merely concurred with him and never questioned his planning. He stated unequivocally that without it, everything collapses. Layla shook her head and smiled slightly. "I don't think everything can be controlled. Sometimes things just happen. Whether you want them to or not." Her remarks made him feel more uneasy than he had anticipated. So he got up and suddenly ended the before returning inside the house. A few days later, he stated, "Talk to Stephanie if you need anything." When Henry made the decision to go with Lila to one of her doctor's appointments, he explained that he wanted to make sure things was going smoothly. But he secretly felt more accountable for Lila's predicament. Exhibited no astonishment, but was secretly fascinated by his choice to undergo the routine exams at the doctor's office. Were carried out, and Layla experienced an unexpected flood of emotion when they heard the baby's heartbeat for the first time. Henry, on the other hand, stayed motionless, his face rigid. Her eyes were watering, but she tried to disguise it. To read, but his eyes had changed. It seemed as though the sound had triggered something within of him. Was unprepared for everything to appear flawless. But the doctor grinned and added, "You can begin considering your next course of action, such as prenatal care and the following steps." Leah nodded, but Henry stayed. Henry was clearly thinking, and Lila was unable to break the heavy stillness in the car as they drove back to the mansion. When they eventually arrived, he opened the door for her, finding the appropriate words to bridge the gap between them. Layla responded, "Thank you for today," in a gesture that startled her as she exited the well. "It was the least I could do," Henry said, avoiding eye contact with her. "Ensure that everything keeps going well." Layla saw his posture as he entered the mansion. Flawless, yet there was something odd about him. Perhaps the sound of his heartbeat had touched a portion of Henry that he concealed. Or perhaps it was all in her head. Over the next few days, Layla started to notice little adjustments, but Henry started to show up more often in the general areas of the house and their chats. He inquired about the specifics of her meetings, how she was feeling, and even proposed one evening, as they ate in solitude at the big dining table, Henry provided her with some relaxation exercises, interrupted the pattern, and inquired, "Have you considered what you want to do now that this is all over?" Layla was taken aback by, "I don't have any plans," she said in response to the query, which was the first time he had expressed any interest in her future. "To be honest, I'm still not sure how my life will turn out after this." Henry nodded, seemingly taking her response into consideration. "Possess the means to start again anywhere you choose. Just make sure you accomplish something meaningful." Layla gave him a glance. She was interested by the apparent hint of real worry hidden beneath the deliberate coldness, but she wasn't sure how to read it. But she didn't feel entirely alone in the mansion for the first time. In the morning, Layla discovered a perfectly wrapped gift at the door of her room. Accompanied with a tiny, Layla was stunned to see a new sketchbook and high-quality pencils inside, along with a handwritten message to help with your free time. She was unaware that Henry was aware of her passion for drawing from a casual conversation they had early on, stated that she used to draw as a diversion, but she never thought he would remember or give a damn. Henry walked by her in the yard one evening and paused to ask, "Did you like the gift?" in a casual manner. "Yes," Leah said, "thank you," holding the sketchbook. "I didn't expect this Henry S. Layla grinned and gripped the gift more securely, shrugging that it would be beneficial for you. Answered simply, Layla started to see that although the mansion's schedule was comfortable and well-planned, it was every day brought a fresh sense of emptiness, as if it were insufficient to resolve the internal issues surrounding her. Although she was physically present, she was not aware of what was going on around her, and Henry kept his Ilila sensed that there was more to the man than his typical tough exterior. One morning, she was taken aback by Henry's sudden remark that he needed them to converse after breakfast, which seemed unusual considering the distance he always kept once they were done. He was waiting behind a pile of papers in the sitting room when Layla approached him. "I would want to go over some more specifics." Layla's heart constricted as he spoke bluntly about the deal, imagining he was about, I believed that everything had already been resolved in order to impose new requirements. She responded, attempting to conceal her anxiety. And Henry observed her for a brief period before saying, "Nothing that changes the words. I just want to make sure you know how things will be following the birth. I want to prevent any." Layla took a long breath in an attempt to remain composed. "And I believe I understand." He nodded slightly, saying, "I'll go and you'll continue on with your life. But I want you to know that regardless of the agreement, I'll be here to help if you need it later." She arched an eyebrow, taken aback by the offer's tone. Distinct, as like he was attempting to demonstrate a level of consideration that had not before existed. Which is surprising coming from you. Unable to contain her irony, she continued, "I don't want complications, and this is the best way." Henry simply shrugged. Layla laughed to get away from them, but something about his earnestness caused her to rethink her sarcasm. Perhaps he was making an effort to stand out, even though he wasn't sure how. Later that day, Layla made the decision to investigate the mansion. Additionally, the space was enormous, with seemingly infinite hallways and rooms that were embellished with artwork that would likely cost more than she could have predicted. While exploring, she discovered a tiny research. She peeked inside a door that was slightly open at the end of a hallway. Henry was sitting at the desk, but he appeared to be staring at a framed photo rather than working. Layla was unable to discern the image's specifics, but she was drawn to his posture anyway. She softly tapped on the door for the first time, seeing him so vulnerable and absorbed in his thoughts. And he promptly said, "I apologize for interrupting," she murmured, placing the picture back on the desk. Henry reluctantly glanced up, obviously taken aback to see her. "But it's nothing." He returned to his bland demeanor and asked, "Did you need anything?" "No, I was just—" Leah hesitated as she looked around the house because she thought she should say more. Henry was silent for a while before responding. "It seems like you were thinking about something important." We all have. She changed the subject because she sensed he didn't want to talk about things we'd prefer keep private. He nodded and crossed his arms, saying, "House is huge. Do you live here alone all the time?" "I don't like diversions, so this is more useful than it sounds." Leah examined him for her, trying to comprehend how someone could be so lonely while living in such luxury. Must be. Henry turned away clearly as she added, "Strange," without giving it any consideration. "Having all this, but no one to share it with." "I don't need somebody to do what I do since I'm accustomed to being uncomfortable." Leah requested to believe him, but there was a hint in his tone that suggested otherwise. Before she could reply, Henry got up. He ended the chat that evening by saying, "Anything Stephanie can help." Lila went outside to the mansion's terrace, where the sky was clear and the distant city lights were twinkling. She allowed her thoughts to wander, recalling the sound of the baby's heartbeat she had heard during the examination. That despite her best efforts to keep an emotional distance, had impacted her in ways she was unable to articulate. Layla turned and saw Henry as she heard footsteps behind her, making it difficult. Appeared worn out, but he maintained the same stiff stance. "You like this spot, don't you?" he remarked as he got closer. Like the stillness, she answered, which makes me believe he paused next to her and stared at Leah, chuckled. But not with much humor, as the city lights briefly illuminated before she said, "Thinking that it's not always a good thing. Try explaining that to someone who is solitary most of the time." Henry didn't immediately answer when he did speak. Leah looked at him and saw that his voice was quieter, and that sometimes being around people doesn't help much either. "Perhaps you need something you can't control, Henry," she answered without understanding the anguish in his words. He scowled as though he wanted to reply, but she didn't regret it, but changed his mind and turned to leave Lila alone. In the weeks that followed, Layla came to the realization that despite her best efforts, she was unable to sustain a stable. Henry remained mysterious despite her barrier, although occasionally tiny tidbits of his, really despite her best efforts to maintain her distance. Something inside of her appeared to want to comprehend the man who had brought her into the world concurrently with Henry's emotional struggles he couldn't remember. But he was starting to realize that he had accepted this deal anticipating control and simplicity. That Layla wasn't only a component in a scheme, and that this was much more complicated, frightened him. The next week, Leah woke up, since it was time for another examination. Early on, I felt a mixture of wonder and concern as the months went by more quickly. More than she had anticipated, and her pulse raised at the thought of seeing the infants for the first time, even on a screen. Wondering whether Henry, who had been there the previous time she came down for breakfast, would be present for this appointment. When she discovered Stephanie going over the schedule with Henry asked, Leah looked up from the paper folder in front of him, ready to respond. Attempting to seem more composed than she felt. "So we'll go together." He didn't give Layla felt the quiet between them as she made her way to the car, but he didn't offer any further explanations. Heavier than normal, Henry remained attentive as usual, but his manner seemed off. Perhaps he was, even though he would never acknowledge it. The doctor's office welcomed them with a friendly, grinning. He gestured for Ilila to lie down while he set up the ultrasound. Equipment today, allowing us to see the baby more clearly. The doctor described how to set the monitor, and Leah examined When the transducer started to glide over her, she tried to ignore the icy gel the doctor was administering to her abdomen. Henry was standing next to her while she held her breath, scared of what might happen. His eyes were locked on the monitor as he crossed his arms. And suddenly, he heard the steady, powerful rhythm of heartbeats. Not just one, but two. This is the surprise that we were unable to witness the previous time. "You're expecting twins," the doctor stated, gesturing to the screen. Expanded in surprise twins. She had never thought of that idea before. She had a rush of feelings that included, She instantly put a hand to her stomach in amazement and delight as she tried to take in the news. Henry, on the other hand, said nothing. For a brief while, his solemn demeanor gave way to a real amazement that Lila had never witnessed before. He asked, leaning forward and closely observing the screen as though he needed. The doctor grinned in response to confirmation too, saying that both appear healthy and are growing well. The only sound in the ensuing silence was Lila's heartbeats reverberating across the space. No matter how hard she tried to keep her emotions at bay, she was unable to stop the enchantment of that moment, feel a connection to the two lives she possesses. Therefore, let's play a game with people who merely read the comments. Enter pizza, the remarks which only visitors will comprehend. Let's go on to the narrative with Henry standing next to her. Seemed equally moved, but he didn't say anything. But his eyes showed something that words couldn't. He appeared vulnerable for the first time, moved by the thought of Beck having 2 children on the way back. There was a distinct, non-cold stillness between them as they arrived at the mansion. The far-off quiet, but Layla's meaningful words finally broke the she said, attempting to diffuse the atmosphere. You don't seem like the kind of person who gets easily surprised. Leah looked at Henry as he sighed, his eyes focused on the road. I'm not, he said, pausing to choose his words. Henry rarely displayed emotion, but he seemed to be buried in contemplation now. Is it frightening? She murmured, almost in a... He turned slightly to gaze at her in a whisper before responding. No. That's impressive. Lila felt a pang of anguish, knowing that 2 entirely new beings would be here in a few months, depending on me. She knew deep down that she would eventually have to let go of those babies. But hearing him discuss them she realized how close she already was to them after receiving such care. They also depend on me, at least for the time being, she murmured, trying. Henry nodded to conceal the passion in her voice, saying, I know, which is why I want to. She remained silent, saying, Make sure you're okay, Ilila. Not just physically, but in every way. Taking in what he was saying, I realized that this was the first time he had discussed their shared experiences with such sincerity. Later that evening, Henry reappeared when Lila was on the terrace, gazing over the horizon. He appeared reluctant, something unusual in his typically self-assured manner, and I can't quit thinking about what the doctor said today. Leah turned to him in astonishment as she started to sit close to her 2 babies, futures. His transparency is a great deal of responsibility, isn't it? She inquired that it goes beyond that. With his eyes set on the horizon, Henry remarked, This is the first time I feel like something in my life can't be calculated. Layla felt cold as she heard those words. I can't control who these 2 will grow into, and I can't plan who they will become. Henry rarely acknowledged when something was out of his control, but she saw that he was evolving just like her. though she said it grudgingly. There are instances when it's a good thing because she didn't know what would happen next. It can lead to unexpected things. Henry gave her a look, as if he was thinking about what she had said for the first time. In the days that followed, he appeared to be coming to terms with the fact that not everything in life could be planned. The news of the Stephanies started making changes to the nursery that had been. Now that it was ready, Layla observed the transformations with mixed emotions. Though she was aware that the agreement compelled her to give up the babies, she secretly. As preparations progressed, Lila and Henry began to recognize that it would be much more difficult than she had anticipated. That the agreement that had brought them together was becoming far more complicated. The twins hadn't even been born yet, were already changing their lives in ways they had not anticipated in the days after the Lila and Henry's dynamic changed little but significantly once the twins were revealed, yet he remained the same restrained, deliberate man, started making little motions, giving Lila a glimpse of him that she hadn't anticipated. Henry insisted on accompanying her to the car in the afternoon, following a doctor's appointment. Something he usually left. Holding the car door, he asked Stephanie or another employee, "Are you okay?" Leah nodded, startled by the gesture. "Yes, I'm okay. Thank you," on the bow. When Henry asked if they needed anything on the trip back to the mansion, their customary stillness was broken. "Might make you feel more at ease." Layla looked at him, attempting to read his expression, but it didn't feel. She wasn't sure how to interpret it yet. But it seemed more sincere than a superficial worry. She warily said, "I don't mind right now, but thank you for asking." Despite her misgivings, Leah felt that something was changing as Henry nodded and shifted his attention back to the road. Appeared to be sincerely worried about her return to the mansion. Leah saw other indications of improvement one day when she discovered a set. She couldn't help but smile when she saw fresh blankets and pillows in her room, with a brief note saying, "To help you rest better." Even though the action was minor, it had significance as she sipped her tea. Henry entered the living room and sat peacefully in the recliner across from her. He appeared more at ease than usual, albeit continued to act gravely. "Did you like what I left in your room?" he said. Questioned directly. "Yes, I did," and Leah said, "That was considerate of you." "He's curiously good, and it's vital to me that you're comfortable." Without averting her gaze, he said, "Me." Leah scowled a little, but she was nevertheless grateful for the generosity. A wall of distrust that she was unable to completely get over because you're transforming Henry. Or at least that's how it appears. But I'm still not sure why she said that. He briefly gazed at her as though, when he finally decided what to say, he sighed. "Maybe you're right, maybe I'm changing. However, the truth is that I don't know how to be different because I'm not accustomed to caring." The words seemed to startle him just as much as they did her, and Henry seldom showed signs of weakness. However, he was displaying a side of himself that seemed to be hidden all the time. Layla thought about the talking while looking up at the sky from the terrace. Henry wasn't what she had anticipated. He was still difficult to understand. Out, but beyond that domineering facade, there was a human side that she wasn't sure was a good or... Unfortunately, Henry was in his office looking at the document that outlined his arrangement with Lila for... He had started this with the specific intention of having an heir and moving on when he first felt the weight of that document with his life. But now that things weren't so straightforward, he realized he was beginning to give a damn. And it scared him. The following morning, Henry went to breakfast with Lila, something he didn't often do. He said directly, "I'd like to talk about something." Lila looked up, wondering what it was. He paused before responding. "I know you still don't trust me, and I can't blame you because I'm good at trusting people, which has made me someone who could be difficult to get along with." Layla remained silent, allowing him to go on. "I've learned from my experiences that I shouldn't rely on other people to keep me safe, enough to harm me, but I've come to the realization that perhaps I'm..." She blinked in astonishment at his candor, as it was uncommon to hear Henry discuss himself in this manner. "We all have our boundaries," Henry continued quietly. "But it doesn't mean we have to live behind them indefinitely." He nodded, perhaps thinking about it. Lila said, "Maybe you're right, but I find it difficult to change." Henry chose to accompany her for a stroll in the garden later that day, and they conversed despite her slight smile. Initially discussing unimportant topics, but the topic of the babies quickly came up again. "Have you considered the names?" he inquired, startling her. "No, I hadn't yet." "I think it would be fair to do it together," she remarked. "But was something you'd want to decide on your own?" Leah was still wary, but she was shocked to see that Henry was attempting to be more approachable and present. He was trying, and she couldn't deny it. As the sun went down, they sat on a garden bench and observed the warm, "I never thought I'd be here doing this, Layla." "But the hues of the sky..." Henry smiled slightly in response, but she whispered, almost to herself, "Neither did I." "Perhaps here is precisely where we should be." Leah glanced at him and saw that, for the first time, Henry appeared to be lowering his defenses. There was a possibility that this was more than simply a contract. It could be the start of... The morning began like any other. But Lila felt the weight of her months-long pregnancy in every action. But she was adamant about maintaining her regimen, and Henry was in their conversations, which were increasingly more frequent, were buried amid documents in the office, become a sort of quiet solace for both. But on that particular day, something was different. Layla experienced an unexpected pain right before lunch that was distinct from any discomfort she had ever experienced. To disregard it, believing it to be simply another normal pregnant ache. But when it became more intense, She became concerned and contacted Stephanie, saw the gravity of the situation right away. And Henry has to be aware of this. Helping Lila sit down could be the beginning of labor, according to Stephanie. Stephanie nodded, while attempting to regulate her breathing as she felt another surge of anguish. She went to fetch Henry, who showed up. Within minutes of entering the room, his typically uncaring expression revealed a rare and sincere care for Layla. He inquired, "What's happening?" And she gasped, "I think it's happening," adding that the babies were on the way. Henry appeared to be frozen for a while, but he soon recovered and picked up the phone to tell the driver to get the car. Prepared and giving Stephanie instructions to grab everything they would need for the hospital we're heading to right now. He stated his Lila had never heard such a stern, yet urgent voice before. And the hospital journey was a flurry of Henry, who was seated next to Lila, regarded her with a mixture of dread and concern as she concentrated on controlling the agony. With a seemingly instinctive gesture of resolve, he kept her hand throughout the journey, but was full with significance. "We're almost there," he whispered, softly holding her hand. "Yoke, be okay." Layla didn't answer, but his words gave her a weird sense of serenity. "We'll be okay." Because of Henry's careful planning, everything at the hospital went swiftly, and a medical team was ready to go. Lila was transported directly to the delivery room for planning, and he remained by her side the entire time, refusing to go. He firmly held Lila's hand and repeated, "I'm staying," in spite of the staff's attempts to convince him to wait outside. In the hours that followed, Henry saw something he never would have thought possible. Leah's strength, as she brought the twins into the world, every second seemed infinite, but also intense in a way he had never experienced before. At last, the room was filled with the first wail, which was both little and Henry, a handsome, healthy kid, was declared by the doctor with a smile that echoed powerfully like a wave of emotion. His heart was pounding, and he was unable to look away from the infant being gently set on a neighboring table before he could completely. A second wail from a child, his daughter, filled the room as he tried to comprehend what was occurring. Layla was worn out, but her eyes were bright as she saw the two infants being carefully cleansed and covered with blankets. Desired to hold them, but she was aware that the moment would only last a short while. Henry stood motionless for a few seconds, observing the doctor's work. And then, as though something within of him had finally given way, he approached Lila, held her hand, and said, "You are amazing gratitude." Lila's face was filled with silent tears. However, she was unable to determine whether they were due to release from joy or a heart that was already starting to crack shortly after the babies were given to Leah, who carefully cradled them and examined them, sensing the warmth and fragility of their tiny existence, absorbing every detail, their small fingers working uncontrollably, their eyes closed in intense love. And she was aware that leaving them would be impossible without taking a piece of them with her. Henry remained mute by her son's side forever. But when he eventually cradled the boy in his arms, and in a way Layla had never witnessed before, his harsh visage softened and he appeared to connect. It was life in its most basic form, with something far beyond the concept of an heir. Henry closed his eyes for a moment, as if attempting to imprint the bond he had never felt before while holding the girl. When he opened them and glanced at Lila, he recalled a moment when she saw something she had never anticipated being real. He murmured in a gruff, emotional voice, "Gratitude. They're perfect." Leah nodded while holding. The boy started crying uncontrollably. But she didn't mind that night as Lila slept. Henry remained by the infant's side in her room while he watched them sleep in the hospital observation area, experiencing a wave of, for the first time, he became aware that these kids weren't merely a mere part of a scheme, or they were his link to something more, something he had never permitted himself to experience prior to genuine love. Stephanie came with coffee, set the cup down on a nearby table, and asked Mr. Lewis if everything was okay. Henry glanced at her, obviously having trouble coming up with the perfect words for. He said, "I believe it's the first time in a long time." And Stephanie grinned and left him by himself with his kids and thoughts, while Leah awoke in her chamber with a deep sense of loneliness. Even while she wanted to be joyful, she was aware that the contract continued to hover over everything, with the babies now at the center of. She knew that she wouldn't be around for long, but when she turned to face the entrance and watched Henry enter with both, something inside her changed as he held the kids, and he appeared different, as though the experience had changed his connection with her as well as the infants. He went to the bed with, I'm not sure how, but the boy sat next to her while holding the girl, looked at the twins and acknowledged that everything had changed. Layla nodded. This moment was a miracle she would never forget, regardless of how challenging the future would be. Months later, Henry's. There was a heavy silence in the mansion, and Leah understood the significance of each day and the next weeks. After the twins were born, she experienced both happiness and sorrow. She loved them more than she ever imagined. Yet it was obvious from the contract that her time there was about to expire, and today was the day she was meant to leave everything behind. Lila looked to the babies' cots, where they were still sleeping, as she packed her few possessions into a tiny suitcase. Tears threatened to flow quietly, but she resisted since she didn't want her to. She realized what she had done and attempted to persuade herself that it was the correct thing to do. Her final recollections would be characterized by weakness. Stephanie entered the room with a troubled expression and gently knocked on the door. She murmured softly, "Is everything ready?" And Lila nodded, swallowing her. Stephanie's assistant glanced at her hesitation before replying, asking if she was sure. Emotions. Yes. Thank you for everything. This is what you desire. It appears that You and Mr. Lewis are more than just friends. Layla forced a smile. My heart was sad. It wasn't about what I wanted, but rather what was decided. Instead of pressing, Stephanie just walked out of the room, saying she would notify Henry when Lila was ready to depart. Leah discovered Henry waiting in the lobby as she down the stairs with her suitcase. He was standing by the front door. His gaze was locked on her. The icy, calculating guy she had first encountered was nowhere to be found. He appeared vulnerable as he stood there, as though he were going to lose something significant. But everything was prepared. Lila broke the pause, but instead of answering right away, he took a stepping toward her. He whispered in a low, somewhat horse-like voice, "Are you really leaving?" Lila felt a pit in her stomach. Neck, but held fast to the agreement. I've fulfilled my end of the bargain. Now it's time to... Henry remained motionless for a moment before extracting the contract from the inside pocket of his coat. He started his contract by holding the document between his fingers as though it were a trivial matter. Voice steadier. Now shouldn't have explained our relationship. Before Lila could reply, Henry ripped the boom reverberated throughout the foyer as the paper broke into fragments and fell to the ground. Layla froze, as if to say, "I don't want you to go, Leah. I don't want this to end here." Her pulse raised as she stared at the pieces of paper on the ground, but fear and agony kept her. Henry is reluctant. It's not that easy to just rip up a contract and hope that things would change. His gaze was full of emotion as he took another step in her direction. I know this is not easy. Nothing about this has been easy, for I never had the confidence to acknowledge it. But these past few months have showed me that I need you, Layla. And not simply because of the twins, but because you added something to my life that I was unaware was missing. His comments struck her, difficult, but she shook her head in an attempt to resist. How can I be certain that this is real? With a shaky voice, she questioned, how can I trust that you won't alter your mind and that you won't pull away when things get, since I've already tried, tough? Henry inhaled deeply, appearing to struggle with his own insecurities. You showed me that I don't have to be terrified of Liv without feeling anything for anyone, which left me empty. I'm afraid of losing this connection to being human, but I don't want to lose it. Leah was crying uncontrollably, yet she was still unable to overcome the obstacle. I fell in love with you, Henry, she confessed, her voice choking with emotion. But you have no idea how difficult it is to trust someone again after being abandoned all of my life. Henry moved so close that I can't believe you won't do the same, that she could sense his breath, since you made a huge difference in my life. And I'm not the type of man who... I don't know how to prove it to you, Leah. But I'm willing to try every day for the rest of my life if Layla felt as though his words were a blow to her barriers. You give me that chance. She knew there were dangers, but for the first time, she thought that perhaps something inside of her was about to give way. Was worth confronting them? She questioned, almost whispering. What if it doesn't work out? Henry grasped her hands and looked straight into her eyes. If needed, we will try again, and I won't give up. Lila felt her misgivings, yet the world never seemed to stop, start to wane, and be replaced by a more resolute hope. She glanced at Henry and saw that he was genuinely prepared to. At last, she nodded, allowing the tears to flow freely. Okay, I'll stay, Henry, she said, letting go of his control and boundaries to be with her, sighed with relief, and gathered her in a close embrace, making Lila realize that this was where she belonged at last. As the day was beginning to dawn at Henry's mansion, Lila awoke to the gentle. That morning, for the first time in a long time, there was something odd about the noises of the twins in the nursery next door. For a long time, she didn't experience the stress of living under the conditions of a contract or the weight of uncertainty. Had made the decision to remain, and more significantly, Henry had made the decision to let his heart open. Lila got up and went to the nursery, where she discovered the two young children so they could construct something together. She leaned over each of them, caressing their flushed cheeks as they shifted in their cribs. Before she could lose herself in the moment, she heard Henry's footsteps behind her and whispered loving words. His eyes, which had usually exuded distance and control, were slightly smiling as he stood in the doorway, taking in the scene. Were suddenly softer and filled with what Lila could only call love. "Good morning," he said as he entered the room. Layla replied, "Good morning," as Henry took up the infant as she approached the infants. I don't think I ever imagined how this moment would feel, as the child, in his arms, gazed at the infant with a glitter in his eyes. He admitted it nearly to himself, and Layla grinned as she saw him develop. There was something incredibly satisfying about witnessing his commitment to his position as a father. The weeks that followed were a period of adjustment for the twins. And despite his lack of expertise, Henry tried to learning to take care of the babies, changing Lila's diapers whenever he could, despite his initial awkwardness. Bottles and even performed a lullaby, even though his growly voice wasn't the most musical. For Lila, this commitment demonstrated that he was genuinely evolving. One night, as Henry turned to Lila as they sat on the couch, the twins in their cribs close by. "I've been thinking about," he asked her inquisitively. "What is it?" with a serious yet composed gaze. Before continuing, I inhaled deeply. "I want us to be a true family, not just because of the twins, but because I desire." Lila was stunned by the intensity of his remarks and remained silent, knowing that he would always be by my side. Though their affections for one another had deepened, she wasn't prepared to hear that revelation. "Henry, this is a huge. Are you sure?" He held her hands and looked deeply into her eyes. she asked, struggling to process the situation. I've never been more certain about anything in my life. I'm aware that this will not be simple and that I made mistakes at first. But I wish to create something with you that is founded on love rather than commitments or contracts. Were genuine. And Lila nodded, tears in her eyes. I want that too, Henry. Let's try only a few weeks later. A private ceremony was placed in the mansion's gardens. Close friends and family were invited, including Stephanie and other employees who had grown to be vital members of their, with the sun shining and a light breeze blowing, the day was ideal. Layla chose a simple yet gorgeous outfit, while Henry looked dapper in the flowers that adorned the site. Stephanie was holding the twins in a cute suit, and she couldn't contain her happy tears as Henry and Lila Henry pledged to be the guy she deserved, someone who would always remain by her side, in their heartfelt vow exchange. Leah pledged to trust him and support him no matter what, become the finest version of himself as they stood holding each other and hugging at the conclusion of the ceremony. Stephanie said that you create a lovely family, and it was true for the twins. For the first time, Henry, Layla, and the infants were in the right place. Following the marriage, life went on with its difficulties, but also happy moments. Henry and Lila collaborated to establish a loving, caring home for the twins after learning how to be parents in the face of demanding schedules and restless nights. One evening, when Lila was placing the infants, she felt both happy and exhausted. Henry showed up at the bedroom door, approached her, and without a word, put a strong grip around her. Lila put her head on his chest and listened to his steady heartbeat. He whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me." That had become so familiar. She said, "Thank you for showing me I could trust again." A few months later, Henry and Lila were in a bright afternoon. The sound of the twins' laughter filled the garden as they played on a soft mat on the grass, spreading pure joy. Contagious joy Leah turned to look at Henry, who was seated next to her. Grinning, she questioned, "Are you happy?" with real curiosity. He glanced at her and, then addressing the twins, he added, "You've given me more than I ever imagined," before responding, "I never thought I could be this happy." Layla grinned, feeling at ease, knowing that I needed her, a family, a purpose, and love. I hadn't felt that way in a long time, and you've shown me that love can endure hardships. I appreciate that as well. The twins started babbling something that sounded like Mama and Dada Henry as they leaned in for a tender kiss. Lila walked closer to the children and showered them with affection as she laughed heartily. That straightforward, unpretentious moment was evidence that they had discovered something genuine. It was full of love, understanding, and hope, even though it wasn't a flawless life. All they required to proceed. What were your thoughts on Henry's actions? Please share them in the "How would you rank this story?" on a scale of 0 to 10. Please leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and enable alerts to stay updated. Enjoy all of our tales, and remember to click here on the final screen to see more heartwarming tales.